I have the honor today of introducing to you Chief P.J. Prosper. And I know a little bit about him because we went to law school together as well too. His call was in 1995, so he's had quite a bit of experience as being an Aboriginal lawyer. He's also had varied other experiences as well too. And I tried to get some information because PJ didn't provide me any information because he's very modest about his endeavors. He's previously been the research director for CMN, co-manager for Nova Scotia Aboriginal Title Project, program manager for MLSN, legal advisor for Treaty and Aboriginal Rights. He's even taught Mi'kmaw governance at the CBU as well too. He has been chief of Paqtnkek, and as he's part of the tripartite committee, he has the justice portfolio. So it's really good that he's coming to talk to us today since our theme is access to justice. I was really happy that he was elected as chief because I think he always had that deep sense of responsibility to community. He kept going back to his community even though he was off reserve doing other things, but he kept going back and making sure that he was giving back to his community. So I know that our communities now are getting healthier, they're getting stronger, we're uniting a little bit more. And I think, as PJ had said before, it's time for a change. We're in the midst of a change, and he wants to be part of that change. So I give to you today, Chief PJ Prosper.
What an introduction. I almost don't want to say anything and just leave it at that. But thank you, Kathy, for introducing me. And it's quite an honor to come and speak to you at such an event here at your annual assembly. And as I understand, this is the largest firm within the province, so it is quite an event for me, and I am honored to speak to you here today. As Kathy has mentioned, I am a Mi'kmaw lawyer and am now chief of the Paqtnkek community. And so when I had discussions with Kathy and Karen, there was sort of discussions as to what I would talk about, and obviously when it comes to justice there's a lot of things to be talked about. But it was decided that I would sort of provide you with a bit of perspective from a community perspective, and to just share with you some comments, some ideas as to what are some of the issues that Mi'kmaw people face, not only at a community setting, but throughout the province in general, and certainly these are not exhaustive. So I have, before becoming chief, which is only 11 months into it, I have thought about leadership and community, mostly from, a theoretical perspective. However, I've come to realize that it has to be a little less theoretical now. In fact, it should be a lot more practical. So I was thinking about that, and I was just sitting away at my desk there, almost trying to lock my way in my office, and I was thinking of all these hypotheticals, what-if scenarios, and if you really get caught up in that you would lose your mind, kind of thing. So, but nonetheless, I started thinking about the many initiatives, the many sort of things that affect Aboriginal people at a community setting. There's policy issues, there's legislative issues, there's things that pop up through litigation. And the status of law, as you all know, is continuously evolving. And despite, when we look to history, despite some of the failed good intentions of government, our communities do still want to move forward on our own terms. So when I reminisce back and when I look back at, this past 11 months, what I come to time and time again is the realization that change is the only constant, and that the only certainty is change. And when I'm looking at change, I think about it both from an external and internal perspective. Externally, there's no certainty with government, with policies, with programs, with funding, even officials. You talk to them one day, and lo and behold, there's another individual in front of you the next. And certainly that exists externally, but internally our communities are changing as well. And I'm sort of blown away occasionally on how this happens, where you notice different things. For example, last weekend I went to my first traditional wedding, which was quite an event. And when you go into funerals, there's always, in many occasions, like a sacred fire. And you take note of these traditions as you move along. And obviously, there are people that take initiatives in their own hands when it relates to land and resource issues through protests and otherwise. And so things like fracking and, the Alton gas project is something that a lot of Aboriginal people take note of in terms of the recognition of basic legal and human rights to lands and resources. And part of this sort of change, this wave of change, includes certain grassroots movements as well. Things like Idle No More or Sisters in Spirit or things of that nature. So these speak to a new way of change or an evolutionary or natural change that is occurring. And when I think of this, when I think of evolutionary change, there's one of two approaches that usually tend to emerge. The first approach is there's somewhat of a fear or resistance to change, as you may or may not know. And when you have that, you have something quite static or stagnant or even stale, and somewhat of an inflexibility associated with that. Another approach is when you have individuals that embrace change. They examine what is possible, and within that group there's a smaller percentage that come to the realization and belief that anything is possible. And I've been thinking about that idea, that concept of anything being possible. And of course, this led me to a series of questions, things like, how do systems and processes like the criminal justice system adapt to change, if that is a possibility? Does the existing system actually work? And if it doesn't, why are we hanging on to it? Has the underlying purpose and justification for the criminal justice system changed? And if yes, is there a plan to move in a new direction? How can we adapt to and embrace other possibilities or potentials of what can be? Is there a better way? A better approach to justice issues, and what can we as Aboriginal people do to help set this new agenda? And finally, it's not exhaustive, but how do we fill the gaps, or rather build a bridge between Mi'kmaw concepts of justice with the mainstream justice system? Many Aboriginal communities possess a certain degree of optimism and excitement in this movement towards change. Often we deal with the need for change. How we deal with it is a matter of perspective, and certainly perspective counts. And just a quick note, do I have 20 minutes? And if I do, can somebody cue me when I'm babbling on too much? But getting back to perspective, we had a meeting with the Regional Director General, and we couldn't use our newer building, the health center, so we had to go to the band office, and our band office is old. And we wanted to treat the regional director general. This is a big person, the head of the Atlantic office, and so we had the meal, and I was trying to figure out a polite way to say that we can't really use her kitchen. So I ended up just stating the obvious to her that it was condemned, and maybe it wasn't a good idea that we start hovering around there. And then I learned later from one of the staff who said, well, she turned to me and said, we really usually don't say that. We just say it's unavailable. So so perspective counts, and it's often how we view the world that leads to the creation of possibilities and potentials of what can be. And so with that rather extended introduction, I just want to outline a couple of points that I want to further talk about in this talk. I do want to make some comments on the Commission's Aboriginal Justice Initiative. It was also requested of me that I comment a bit about the portfolio system available through the Assembly. I'll talk a bit about some current justice issues, and finally get into some perspectives that I think are relevant, not only from an individual, but family, community, and nationhood perspective. Does anybody have any water? If you don't mind. Thank you so much. I find it quite dry, so. Oh, thank you very much. I'll just put this right here. But as indicated earlier by Kathy, there is an Aboriginal Justice Initiative, and I certainly commend the Commission for undertaking such an initiative, which is responsive to First Nations people who are involved or in need of legal aid. There is a platform and brochure that presents various options that exist for Aboriginal people through legislation. As mentioned earlier by Naomi, there is service delivery that takes place within roughly 7 Aboriginal communities, and my community of Paqtnkek is one of them. There is a new initiative involving a full-time Aboriginal social worker, which is a great addition. And certainly these are timely and much needed initiatives. And as part of the Commission's 3-year plan, their vision is, as I understand, without meaningful access to justice, there is no justice. And part of the values supporting that is things like responsiveness, excellence, and accountability. Some of the priority areas involve child welfare issues, restorative justice, and sentencing, which is a great beginning for this first-time initiative. You are often the first and last justice support system network for clients throughout the province. Many of you are on those front lines, and no doubt you have tremendous insights on the strengths and weaknesses of the current process, the current system. You make a tremendous difference in the lives of the many people you serve, and you are certainly to be commended in your efforts in that regard. Regarding the Assembly and Portfolio System, as Naomi mentioned, it's somewhat of a recent initiative, and when I say that, it's maybe in the last 2 to 3 years. I initially was handed the portfolio of energy from my predecessor in the community, the former chief, and more recently, Jeanette Peterson was provided with the justice portfolio, and it's one of those situations when you leave the room, you go to the bathroom, and you come back, and you find out you get a new portfolio. But I'm excited, to take on that. It's a bit of a challenge, I must admit, because of the multitude and complexity of the issues involving justice as it relates to First Nation community settings. So Naomi gave a really good sort of overview of the Assembly and the organizations and things like that, so I'm not going to sort of go through that again, but just to say that the main sort of institution for governance is the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaw Chiefs for the Mi'kmaw of Nova Scotia. We're in a process of evolution, and we often think of how can we improve our governance practices, and so there's often a need to balance the needs of the community with the more general needs of the nation in general. So we're endeavoring to work and develop governance systems and processes to deal with that. So, as leaders, we often have to balance other commitments, competing priorities for time and resources, but that's something that I'm sure you are all quite familiar with. So, more recently, there have been some key justice issues that I believe have come to light. These require the attention of the Assembly and other levels of government, and I'll just go into just a few of them, some key ones. One involves Mi'kmaw Children and Family Services. A bit of background: about 25% of children in care in the province are of Aboriginal descent. Their budget, the Mi'kmaw Children and Family Services budget, less than 5% of that budget goes towards prevention. A couple of years ago, that organization had undergone a review in terms of the services they provide and the comparability that exists through the province, and what was found that with their staff of 63, that they had to bump it up to roughly about 113 positions. So currently they have about 109 positions within their organization. There is a lack of programs and services that exist in First Nation community settings. The funding for the Mi'kmaw Children and Family Services Agency is governed through a tripartite agreement. It's a voluntary agreement, so it's subject to negotiations, and often the bottom line is money as it relates to our children and their involvement within that system. And as Naomi has mentioned earlier, thanks to the existing government, the Harper government, some very significant cuts have been made to a variety of organizations right across the board, thus, decreasing the level of services that exist within the community. So, needless to say, through the tripartite agreement as a voluntary agreement, the federal government can walk out at any time. And essentially what happens is our children are caught in the crossfire. At times what you have is bureaucrats sort of viewing this from a dollars and cents sort of thing rather than looking at the actual need that exists within the community. There is a window of opportunity, as I understand. This Children and Family Services Act, about 25 years old, is undergoing a review where certain amendments are being sought to this piece of legislation. It's rather a tight timeline. I believe they're looking to introduce something in the House around the fall of 2015. And certainly as Mi'kmaw, we need to play a very active and important role within that process. And, it's something to look towards, and some things that we have discussed at a political level is sort of utilizing this opportunity as a transitional stage to sort of bring more capacity within the Mi'kmaw Nation as an interim step, and then eventually trying to consider things related to self-governance among Mi'kmaw people as it relates to our own children. It was also mentioned as one of the organizations is the Mi'kmaw Legal Support Network. It's a justice support system for Aboriginal people involved in the criminal justice system. Since its inception, there has been no core funding provided, despite repeated calls for core funding to exist within that entity. And, staff, you can imagine when you have no core funding, there's a bit of uncertainty, and the budget hasn't really changed. So, you have committed and dedicated staff working significant hours and dealing with a multitude of issues that haven't received a raise in about 5 years, probably a little more than that, I would imagine. So, it provides, the Mi'kmaw Legal Support Network provides a foundation for change, and it has tremendous potential. However, it does need that solid commitment from government to support these essential programs and services. There is a process that Dr. McMillan is going to be commenting about, a review of the recommendations made in the Commission report on Donald Marshall Jr. And through that exercise, I'm certainly going to leave it to her to sort of get into the substance of that. But what it does, at a general sort of way, is it highlights the need for continued change and development in the criminal justice system. And within it, a number of key justice pathways have been identified. And it speaks to certain things like the creation of an institution to provide holistic Indigenous justice services, an Aboriginal court, comprehensive community codes, the creation of an Aboriginal justice strategy that incorporates Indigenous justice protocols into the actual practice of law, the improvement and creation of kinship and family court programs and services, and improvement and innovation in community policing. So these provide a solid basis to develop formulas to basically improve the criminal justice system. They can help build a bridge from an Aboriginal perspective on the improvement of justice programs and services within our communities. Just a note further on Aboriginal and treaty rights. I always feel inclined to maybe talk a bit about that. The current sort of attitude with government as it relates to rights is a lot of times negotiation without recognition. This is sort of highlighted in the fact that it has been only recent that the federal government has had a mandate to negotiate the Donald Marshall fishing decision, Supreme Court of Canada decision. To my understanding, the federal government does not have a mandate to engage in sparrow discussions from a decision back in the early 90s. So it sort of gives you a certain flavor of where we're at in terms of gaining recognition of basic legal and human rights that the Mi'kmaq have to lands and resources. And certainly that is an access to justice issue. And it requires a commitment from both levels of government to respect the decisions of the highest court within this country, the Supreme Court of Canada. And finally, one of the things I just want to comment on is, the existing situation with missing and murdered Aboriginal women, roughly 582 and counting missing and murdered Aboriginal women. There was a call for an inquiry to take place on this. This was denied by the government, and there's a need to really just sort of look at it for what it is and what that call for an inquiry is. And a lot of people try to attend fault, or attribute fault to it, but what these exercises tend to do is to achieve at least a common understanding, between a variety of players here, and the need to and once you get that understanding, you can then work to improve relationships. These are not singular events, and they need to be viewed in their entirety. There is a need not only for healing to occur, but for remembrance and recognition. Recognition for the sacredness of life and the spirit of the feminine divine that lies within each of us. These are just some of the issues to help inform context for a future dialogue. The approach to Mi'kmaw justice involves a combination of perspectives. These include an individual, family, community, and nationhood perspectives. Each of these perspectives interlock to help form a bridge where the Mi'kmaw and government can create inroads from both sides and meet halfway. This is my vision of Mi'kmaw justice in Nova Scotia. Getting into the perspectives of the person, I go back to change and I note that change always starts from where you are and always begins with you. I was listening to an elder one time, it was about 6 months ago, and he said a word that really struck me, and what he said was energy. And it was the way he said it. He just had his hands out and he said, energy. And I thought about that, and some months later, I was listening to another elder who talked about the Mi'kmaw who are entering into a new cycle, from one 7-generational cycle to another. And it got me to think about energy and cycles of energy. And through discussion with some people, I was led to find out that, some Mi'kmaw believe that we are entering a new cycle of energy, one that is lighter, less dense, and of a higher vibration. And at the core of the Mi'kmaw Nation, there is spirit. This is first realized at a personal level, and it often involves a balance to a reality that is constantly dynamic and in constant flux. At times, it's like riding a wave where we seek to maintain a balance between the physical and non-physical, what some people refer to as the seen and unseen, and also the idea of giving and receiving, what some refer to as the masculine and feminine nature. We are first and foremost creator beings, and our creator ability rests in how we connect to our spirit, to the spirit of our nation. Scientists have found that the electromagnetic field of the heart is 60 times greater than that of the brain, and that it can actually be measured several feet from the body. And as Mi'kmaw, we are continuously remembering the limitations of the mind, and that true wisdom and understanding comes from being heart-centered. Just a bit about the family, and as many of you know, the family is the backbone of the Mi'kmaw Nation. Personally, when I think back and look back at my community, it would be hard for me to imagine our community without our Mi'kmaw women, because I get to see how they interact and the things they do on a day-to-day basis. With respect to youth, they are hardwired for change, and many of you as parents would know that, and they are more connected than ever before. They are our future, and our role as communities and leaders is to instill codes of connection to spirit, to help them guide their way within this journey, this path called life. And finally, as it relates to family, there are siblings. And they often remind you of who you are within the larger collective. Sometimes they remind you subtly, sometimes not. For example, I had an experience, I was probably 3 months in on my sort of election, and it's almost classic, almost ceremonial, but a rock was thrown through my picture window, but I was glad to see it was a family member. So, So through larger kinship ties and networks, there are distinct roles and responsibilities. And these are revisited and tweaked accordingly to keep pace with social and cultural change. 1 minute. Okay. I'll just leave with certain perspectives on the nation. And the only certainty is change. And the Mi'kmaw have had to adapt to changing political, social, and cultural landscapes. And through this, we not only survived, but we thrived. And it is this trait of adversity that is embedded within our DNA and allows us to view what is possible from a different perspective. Just to give a brief example, we had our powwow late September, and we heard about this sort of march that the Naomi Society was putting on. It was called the Respect for Women. And essentially we thought maybe we would do a march within the community, but what that later turned out into is quite an event at the powwow where it led to a dance where all the men came into the arbor and danced around, and then when all the men came in, the women came in later, and as they were meeting the men in a circle, they were shaking and hugging and things of that nature. So it sort of gives you an idea of the power of community. And certainly the power of community can and should play an important role within any justice model. And with that, I just want to recognize the time. So I want to thank you very much for listening to me, and obviously enjoy your future discussions. Take care.